Amen. Well, tonight we're doing the third installment on Samson, and it's just a wonderful privilege to get to teach this and to read over it and learn so many things, so many lessons. So I want to start in Judges chapter 13, because again, as we overview Samson, there's certainly some typology of Christ, some echoings of what happened to Jesus Christ. I'm sure that when Jesus Christ read the record of Samson, he saw this stuff, but there was a divine prophecy over both their births. It was an angel that announced to both mothers, Mary and Samson's mother, that they would get pregnant. Samson's name is related to the word son, and Malachi tells us that one of the titles of Jesus Christ was the Son of Righteousness. Samson began to deliver God's people from their enemies, and that's exactly what Jesus Christ has done, and he will finish that deliverance in his second coming. God was the one who began to stir Samson against the enemy, and God, when he gave Jesus Christ Holy Spirit, the first thing that happened was the Spirit drove Christ into the wilderness where he was tempted by the devil, and for 40 days and entered into that spiritual battle. The people around Samson didn't understand his mission or his ministry, and even Jesus's family didn't understand Jesus's mission and his ministry, and they came to arrest him or take charge of him because they thought he was insane. And then finally, and sadly, and what we'll see tonight, is both Samson and Jesus died in a crucifix position. Both of them died with their arms out and their feet underneath them. And we see that in Samson, and we see that in Jesus Christ. So there's some very helpful parallels between Samson and Christ. And that being said, let's go to Judges chapter 16. So we did chapter 13, where the angel announced Samson's birth, chapter 14, where he started his ministry and God began to stir him up, and he began to move against the Philistines, chapter 15, the same, chapter 16. And we start out by saying, and Samson went to Gaza and saw a prostitute there and went into her. And one of the things we see in the Samson record is there are 3 cycles, if you will, of Samson seeing or getting involved with a woman, and then that relationship, and in 2 of them, the woman then pulls him in, then betrays him. And then there's problems, and then fighting with the Philistines, and the Philistines end up, being harmed, or they're worse off for it. Now, a lot of the scholars will look at this and say, well, Samson was just a sex maniac. He was driven by sex. We know that isn't the case. I believe God worked in Samson. When it came to these women, at least to a certain degree, there was certainly an interaction between the Spirit of God and the people the women that Samson got involved with. This is a subject that's kind of it's kind of hard to exactly put your finger on, because there's times when he overstepped the line, and we certainly see that tonight in chapter 16. But if we look here, and it says that Samson went to Gaza and saw a prostitute there and went into her, how do we know that's the Spirit of God working? Well, from chapter 14, we know that God was seeking an occasion against the Philistines, and he was trying to motivate his people to come against the Philistines, which was his original plan. And if we what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a map. Let me share my screen here. At this point, you should be looking at a map of Israel. And so here's Samson, and he's up here right where, if I could put the thumb on it, right in this area right here with Zorah. Here's the town of Zorah. And so this is basically Samson's hometown. And you've got the 5 capital cities of the Philistines: Ekron, Gath, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. So if Samson just wanted a prostitute, I guarantee you he could find one within the palm of his hand. And yet, look what he does. From his hometown, he goes 40 miles southwest to the furthest south capital city of the Philistines. Now, there's something very interesting about that, because that city is on the Via Maris, the way of the sea, the major route that comes out of Egypt and then heads on up eventually through the Galilee, through a branch of it through Capernaum, and then off to Damascus. So what does that tell you about this town? Here's Gaza. And if the Egyptians are attacking, which they did periodically, then this town's going to be the first one to fall in the Philistine Empire. So you know this thing was fortified to the hilt. And Samson, of all the places you want, like I say, if he just wanted sex, within the palm of his hand, he'd find sex. So he's seeking an occasion against the Philistines. He goes all the way down here over 40 miles to an incredibly well-fortified Philistine city. And so that's what's going on here. So Samson went to Gaza, come on, go away, and saw a prostitute there and went into her. Verse 2, the Gazites were told, Samson is here. Now, Samson's, all of his fighting and stuff had been done about 40 miles north. And what this tells you is that the whole Philistine nation was attuned to who Samson was and what he was doing. And he'd been a judge for some 20 years, almost 20 years by this point. So the Gazites were told, Samson is here. They surrounded the house and waited in ambush for him all night in the gate of the city, the obviously well-fortified city of Gaza, and were quiet all that night, saying, wait until morning light, and then we will kill him. So they were going to kill Samson, and they were waiting. Verse 3, Samson lay until the middle of the night. And of course, the Philistines weren't expecting that, so they had probably gone to sleep, frankly. He waited till the middle of the night and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts, and pulled them up, bar and all. And the bar was the big, huge crossbeam bar that kept those gates together, and put them on his shoulders and carried them up to the top of a hill that faces Hebron. So here, he's down here in Gaza, where the thumb is, and he's now gone into the main gate of the city, which is thick, huge, heavy, and it's not just sitting there like you can just pick it up and carry it off. It happens to be attached. And so you've got the side posts, and the side posts that hold a heavy gate so that it's not dragging in the dirt. Those side posts are ridiculously heavy, and they're put in the ground. And then there's the big, huge, heavy crossbeam, and he goes up and takes hold of this massive structure. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly how. My money, he probably grabbed the crossbar and used that to wedge things up. Well, what does he do with this? He carries it to a hill in front of Hebron. So here he goes to Hebron, and it's about the same distance, interestingly enough, north and south and east to west. He basically carries this structure uphill from the Philistine, this is the Mediterranean coast, through the Shephelah, which you can see the little mountains here on the map beginning to develop, into the hill country of Judah, to Hebron, which is either the highest or second highest city in all of Israel at this time. It's also on the major road coming up from the south, going through Hebron, it's on what's called the Patriarch's Way. The road comes up from the south, goes through Hebron, goes through Bethlehem, goes to Jerusalem, and parts north. Now remember, at this time with Samson, Jerusalem wasn't conquered yet. Oh, well, if Jerusalem isn't conquered yet and it's not the capital city, what's at that time ostensibly the most important city in Judah? Hebron was. That's why David went there and made Hebron his capital city. So what is Samson doing? Carrying these city gates uphill some 40 miles and setting them by Hebron. It's so everybody can see, everybody can get the message. Hey, people, that God can protect us. God can bless us. In God, we are strong to take the enemy. God will open the gates. God will open the way for us to take conquer the Philistines, which was God's command back at the time of Joshua. And the people of Israel simply had not moved on it. They had not obeyed God. And here's Samson, and he takes these huge gates to either the highest or second highest city in Israel, and on this major road, drops them off, and everybody what are they? And Israel isn't listening. And this is one of the tragedies of the whole Samson record, is that Israel isn't listening. And sometimes, we can feel that way about the church, that the Christian church isn't listening. They aren't motivated. They aren't taking risks. We've got to be very cautious, just simply to pray for them and do our job. We're not the judge. We're not the critics. We're to be motivated and to motivate others. And that's what Samson was trying to do. And it can be real easy to get discouraged by the lack of participation of others. And that's one of the lessons in Samson. Samson eventually got discouraged by that, and it brought him down. We'll read about that as we continue to read. So anyway, Israel wasn't listening. They didn't get the lesson of the city gate of a capital city in the Philistine area. So verse 4 goes on, and now we're into our third cycle with Samson and a woman. And each one of these cycles ends with some kind of harm to the Philistine nation. As we learn, as we read about this third cycle, we find out that this is the most devastation that Samson did to the enemy. And so it says, verse 4, after this, he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek. Now, this is very close to his home. So he's not going very far to find this woman here. He loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the scholars argue back and forth about what the meaning of the word Delilah is. There's several possibilities. One of the possibilities that I think is the truth is Delilah means languishing away or pining away or wasting away. And in the same, I think that's the meaning of Delilah, because that's what God does through the scripture. He gives people names that let you know what's going on in the record. Like Job, the word Job means, what it means basically is the attacked one. Well, I don't think there was a mom that named her kid, oh, look, a baby boy, I'm going to call him the attacked one. But that's what people knew him as after he was attacked by Satan and then denigrated and attacked basically by his friends. But he survived and did beautifully, and he became known as the attacked one. Here, I think Delilah means wasting away, and by knowing that, you kind of get a preview of what's going to happen to Samson. And we've got to remember that the prophecy the angel gave in chapter 13 over Samson was that he would begin to deliver the children of Israel from the Philistines, that he would not finish. And of all the judges, Samson's the only judge that's mentioned who died before the deliverance of the people that he was against, like when Ehud fought with the Moabites. Ehud outlived the Moabite oppression. Deborah outlived the Canaanite oppression. Jephthah outlived the Ammonite oppression. But Samson did not outlive the Philistine oppression, but he did do what the angel prophesied, that he began to deliver Israel from the Philistines. So Samson finds this woman, and he loves this woman in the valley of Sorek, and her name was Delilah. Verse 5, so the lords of the Philistines, remember there's 5 of them, 5 capital cities. Each city contributes 1 lord to a 5-man council, and the rule of that council is law in Philistia. So here the lords of the Philistines, 5 of them, came up to her and said to her, entice him and see where his great strength lies and how we can overpower him so that we can bind him to subdue him. And we will each give you 1,100 shekels of silver. Excuse me. This gives you an idea of how incredibly dangerous the Philistines thought that Samson was. They are willing to put a bounty on his head of 5,500 shekels of silver. Let's put that in perspective. You remember Abraham bought the cave and the field of Machpelah from Ephron the Hittite. Abraham bought that field and the cave for 400 shekels of silver. You remember when David bought the threshing floor of the Jebusite Araunah because God said he was going to build the temple there. And David went up and he bought the whole hilltop for 50 shekels of silver. And Jeremiah bought a field in Anatoth for 17 shekels of silver. This is 5,500 pieces of silver. I mean, that's like billionaires in her time period. That's an absolutely astounding amount of money. And one of the things that it shows us is that even if worldly people don't think they're money motivated, generally speaking, and unless you are just really, really set on obeying God, then money and power sway people. Money and power change people. And we see that here. And so there's a lesson here for us. And again, we have to tread a little lightly because Delilah was a Philistine. And we don't know exactly. The Bible never states her commitment to Samson before these guys showed up with 5,500 shekels of silver. But what we do see here is that money is an amazing motivator, and people will get involved in a lot of immoral stuff and a lot of illegal stuff and hurt a lot of innocent people for money. And that's one of the lessons that we see here. So verse 6, so Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies and how you can be bound to subdue you." Now, what the Bible's doing here is it's distilling days and hours of conversations into a sentence. You know, if you were going to watch the interaction between Delilah and Samson to where she could get to this point to say, "Tell me where your strength lies," you know, we'd be in front of a movie screen for a number of days, because you know that she didn't just come right out and ask this. This is a whole process of, do you love me? Do you care for me? And interestingly enough, this is precisely what Samson had gone through with the woman from Timnath that he loved. If you look at Judges chapter 14, and we'll just read verse 16, when Samson went to Timnath and he had a riddle, and it was out of the eater came forth meat, out of the strong came something sweet, and it was about the lion and the honey. And verse 16 says, so Samson's wife wept before him, Judges 14:16. And she said, "You surely hate me and do not love me," which is actually an interesting thing, because in reality, the exact opposite was true. She didn't love him, but hated him. But it's interesting that when you're dealing with twisted mindsets, they turn the whole process over. But basically, you hate me, you do not love me. You've told a riddle to the children of my people and haven't told it to me. And so this would have been going on behind the scenes with Samson and Delilah as well. So when she says, "Please tell me where your great strength lies and how you can be bound to subdue you," it's in the context of, if you really love me, you'll share your deepest secrets with me. In verse 7, and Samson said to her, "If they bind me," and we'll cover this in just a second, but at this point, Samson trusted in his humor and his own personal strength, and he had used humor before. Remember, he'd been alone now. He'd been judging Israel for 20 years. He never had anybody stand with him, so he'd been alone, and to a degree, he had sustained himself by humor, things that he could laugh at. So it was, the riddle with the woman at Timnath, and then catching the jackals and tying them up and setting their fields on fire and making a little poem after he killed 1,000 men with the jawbone of an ass. So he was used to leaning on his humor. And I think one of the lessons in here, Jesus Christ was alone in his head for so much. I mean, his mother and father didn't understand him. His brothers didn't even believe in him. His apostles were confused all the time. They're at the Last Supper. Does anybody know what he's saying? Jesus Christ, in his own understanding of his mission, what he was doing, where he was going, he was very much alone. And I think there's a warning here in Samson for Jesus Christ and for us of be aware of where your strength lies. Where is your strength? What is the center of your stability and your godliness? And then don't overplay it. Excuse me, because Samson had basically hung in there for all this time alone and leaned on his sense of humor, but now here he overplays it, and it's going to end up very badly. It'll end up in his death. But we would be naive to think that Jesus Christ didn't read this, identify with the loneliness that Samson was feeling, but get the message, okay, God, I get it. Whatever I'm doing within my mind to deal with this loneliness, I don't overplay it, because you could see in Samson what would happen if you overplayed, we call it too much of a good thing. So Samson comes up with this thing, verse 7, well, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have never been dried, then I will become weak and be as any other man. Which, of course, is total fabrication. But, within himself, he's going, hey, this is going to be really funny. Excuse me. And by the way, the bowstrings, remember that they made bowstrings at that time period generally out of animal gut, and then it would be stretchy and fresh. And then when it dried, it shrank and became hard. So it made a good thing to tie people up with. And so that's what Samson says. So verse 8 says, then the lords of the Philistines brought up to her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she bound him with them. And the Bible doesn't go into the details of how she managed to do that. Verse 9, now she had an ambush waiting in the inner room. In the biblical culture, the inner room that a man was not allowed in was the woman's apartment. So basically what would have happened here is that the Philistine army men that were waiting for Samson were hiding in the woman's apartment that Samson wouldn't have gone into, would not have looked into, and frankly may not have even suspected that anybody was in there. But as soon as she tied him up, then she said, the Philistines are on you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings just as a string of flax is broken when it smells fire, which is a pretty cute analogy. So his strength was not known. Let's go back and pick that up. Flax was the string that they used as a candle wick for their oil lamps, an oil lamp wick, if you will. And it's the oil lamp, if you hold a string close enough that if it was a person that could smell the fire, then the string becomes weak. And you guys all know how easy it is to break a piece of candle wick that's been burned. And so that's what it's talking about here. There was no strength compared to Samson's strength. There was no strength in these bowstrings. So his strength was not known. Verse 10, then Delilah said to Samson, behold, you mocked me and told me lies. And, at this point, we just are, and I confess, I'm dumbfounded that Samson even hung around. As soon as the Philistines jumped out and were going to subdue him, I wouldn't hang around Delilah anymore. this may have something to do with him wanting a greater interaction with the Philistines to defeat them. I'm not really sure. But she says, you've mocked me and told me lies. He could have said, well, you seem to have told me plenty of lies. But anyway, she says, now please tell me how you can be bound. And so once again, he goes to the well of his humor to find personal strength. And he said to her, if they bind, yes, bind me with new ropes with which no work has been done, then I will become weak and be as any other man. So the same thing happens. We have another repeat. Delilah took new ropes and bound him with them and said to him, the Philistines are on you, Samson. The ambush was waiting in an inner room, but he broke them off his arms like a thread. And of course, he got away, probably beat up the Philistines, big mess. Verse 13, Delilah said to Samson, until now you've mocked me and told me lies. Tell me with what you might be bound. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 braids of my head into the web on the loom. And what we see here is Samson is weakening. He's now beginning to talk about his hair. And even though Delilah doesn't know it, Samson's resolve and is wearing down, and you can see that. And again, there's a lesson for you and I here, and we'll see that in the next verse or two very clearly. Verse 14, so she did that. She fastened the loom with the pin and said to him, the Philistines are on you, Samson. But he awakened out of his sleep and pulled out the pin of the loom and the web. And of course, then you have big fight or whatever, and the Philistines are beaten up, and you go through the whole process again. Verse 15, and she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? And this is the first time we really see that Samson was saying to her, I love you. So Samson here had allowed himself to get emotionally entangled with this Philistine woman in an unhealthy way. And this is something that happens to people. They get emotionally entangled with a person who's unhealthy. And that's one of the things that you and I, as helpers, counselors, fellow Christians, people with our eyes open, people who are not emotionally involved with the situation, can just really be a voice of reason, help people make good decisions, help people get unentangled. But Samson didn't have anybody like this, and he was lonely. So for whatever reason, he was saying, I love you. And she says, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? You've mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. Verse 16, it came to pass when she pressed him hard with her words daily and pressured him, that his soul was exasperated to death. And this is an amazing verse for Christian people to be aware of, because there are just so many hard, harsh, evil situations in life that people get entangled in, and then you kind of lose your vision, and you think, well, you have a job that's just beating you down daily, and it's like, well, but I need the money. And you can't see your way out of the situation, or you're entangled in a relationship. Excuse me. Excuse me, I'm still dealing with this end of this laryngitis thing. So you're entangled in this relationship, and you just can't see your way out. And you need other people to come in and to help you see your way out. But this thing here, that she pressed him hard with her words daily, this is so difficult to overcome, and he's exasperated to death. And we see this in scripture. A great example of this, let's go to 1 Kings chapter 19. Another man who felt very much alone and whose life was threatened was Elijah. And he was a great man of God, a powerful prophet, but he felt he was alone. Remember, he said to God, I'm the only one left, to stand for you, who hasn't bowed the knee to Baal. And That's very hard to, when you feel trapped and you feel alone. We look at 1 Kings chapter 19. So Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done. She sent a messenger, verse 2, to Elijah saying, may the gods do so to me and more also if I do not make your life as their life, or the life of one of them by this time tomorrow, meaning, I'm going to kill you. Verse 3, he was afraid, rose and ran for his life. Verse 4, he goes a day's journey into the wilderness. Watch verse 4. He went a day's journey into the wilderness, came, sat down under a broom tree, and he asked that he would die. This is a fantastic, unbelievable, monstrously powerful man of God, but he's so worn down by loneliness and in circumstances that he just doesn't see how he's going to make it through, so he just asks to die. This is very real stuff. We have people killing themselves in America all the time, committing suicide all the time because they can't see their way out. They don't see their value and they don't see their way out. And we Christians have to be aware and self-aware of when are we feeling trapped? When are we feeling uncomfortable? When are we feeling that we're in a situation that we just can't get out of? When are we feeling like our life is going to be miserable for the rest of our days, type of thing? And then we have to be willing to reach out. And as listeners, those of us, the other side of it, we have to be willing to get involved in people's lives and help pull them through this. I mean, I look at the things that Elijah did, the miracles that he did, the calling down fire, doing all that kind of cool stuff. And then he asks to die. It is enough now, O Yahweh, take my life. That's, what's this doing in the Bible? I mean, why would God have this in here? Because we can get to be, we can get to be in the same position. If we're not careful, if we allow ourselves to be entangled into a situation where we're just feeling more and more helpless, we can be in the same position. God puts this stuff in the Bible so we can say, wow, this is real life. This is stuff we've got to be self-aware when it's happening to us. We need to be socially aware when we see others that are in the midst of this, so that we can speak to them, so that we can help them. Let's go back to Judges 16. So verse 16, Judges 16:16, it came to pass when she pressed him hard with her words daily and pressured him, that his soul was exasperated to death. Verse 17, and he told her all his heart, and said to her, no razor has ever come up on my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaved, then my strength will go from me, and I will become weak and be like all other men. And verse 18, and of course that was true. And he just got pulled into it. And verse 18, when Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up this once, for he has told me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought her the silver in their hand. Absolutely. They're going to show up with the money and she's going to deliver the goods. Verse 19, and she caused him, Samson, to sleep on her knees, and she called for a man, and he shaved off the 7 braids of his head, and she began to humiliate him, and his strength left him. So even Delilah at that point began to humiliate Samson. Probably Delilah began to humiliate him verbally, laughing at him, mocking him, and then the humiliation continued. The Philistines blinded Samson. They made him grind grain like a woman. They tortured him publicly. So his strength left him, verse 20, and she said, the Philistines are on you, Samson. He awoke out of his sleep and said, I will go out as at other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that Yahweh had left him. And there's a great lesson in that for you and I, that first of all, you don't feel the presence of Spirit. You can have the great power of Holy Spirit and not know it. And that certainly In this case, the spirit left, and Samson did not know that either. And so he didn't know that Yahweh's spirit had left, and he didn't know that his strength had left with it. Verse 21, and this shows, the Philistines knew how to handle this. The Philistines grabbed him and gouged out his eyes. So, if we can get him blind, then we know that even if his strength comes back, we can kill him, if nothing else, with bow shots. But the Philistines grabbed him and gouged out his eyes, and they brought him down to Gaza. So they took him back down to Gaza, where he had torn the gates off, and bound him with bronze chains, and he had to grind grain in the prison. And that grinding grain with the little grinding wheel was what the women in the culture did. So again, this is a process of humiliation and breaking down his resolve. And then we have verse 22, and verse 22 is very interesting. It says, but the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Well, now, you and I know that the Nazirite vow is not, well, if you cut your hair off, then you break the vow. But if you let it grow back, then the vow comes back. There's nothing like that. He'd broken the vow. So the fact that his hair came back that didn't mean anything like God is now going to somehow honor the vow. So then we ask, well, what's going on here? Here's this verse that says the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. And yet we know that the verse is not saying, and if he gets his hair back, then he'll get his strength back, because that's not the way the Nazirite vow worked. So what's going on here? And what's really going on here is Samson's hair began to grow back. He remembered what he was, who he was. He remembered his mission. He remembered what he was supposed to do. He's rising up in his soul. He'd been completely defeated by Delilah. Her name meant wasting away, and that's exactly what she did to him. He had been completely defeated. I was, reading commentaries and stuff about the record, and they talk about, Samson when he died and how he was defeated. And it's like they missed the point. Samson was not defeated when he died in that Philistine temple. He was defeated by Delilah when he told her all his heart. That's when he was defeated. And it was in the temple that he shouted a cry of victory. And we'll look at that in a second. But anyway, the hair of his head began to grow again, and after he'd been shaved, because it was an inspiration to him, and it reminded him of who he was and what his mission was. And I began to think about the things that you and I do that inspire us. What do I wear an anchor around my neck. I bought it when we were on a Bible Lands tour, and we're on one of the Greek islands, and I know the anchor is the anchor of the soul. And this is one thing. I shower with this. I sleep with this. It basically, you can ask my wife. Excuse me, you can ask my wife. It just basically never comes off. It's like my wedding ring. It just basically never comes off. It's an inspiration to me. Lots of times when I'm wrestling with things in life, I almost unconsciously, I'll reach up and I'll just grab my anchor and hang on to it and focus on it and think about the hope. And it's like, you can do this, you can hang in there, control your mind, move forward, and some people have paintings on their wall or inspirational sayings on their wall or something in their life that inspires them and blesses them and keeps reminding them of who they are and what their mission is and that type of thing. And that's a godly thing. And we see that right here. The hair of his head began to grow again. Again, no promise that the vow is going to be honored, but it's inspiring Samson. So verse 23, now the lords of the Philistines gathered together for a sacrifice, to sacrifice a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. For they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hand. And of course, they weren't right about that. Their God did not give Samson. But this tells you one of the things about idolatry. People that are involved in idolatry think that idols and such gives them power or authority, that in reality, it's just a lie. It's just smoke and mirrors, but it's hard to disprove. So they're like, okay, well, this Dagon, our God, delivered our enemy, Samson. And then verse 24, and when the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, our God has given into our hand our enemy and the destroyer of our land, who has slain many of us. And that's an interesting admission. And that's why the Philistines knew who Samson was, because he'd been at this for 20 years and he killed many of them in the 20 years without one stick of help from any of the other Israelites. Where are the other Israelites? They're absent, they're AWOL, they're gone. It's horrible when God's people don't step up and get involved in the fight. But for 20 years, Samson hung in there and fought this fight alone. It's a long time to fight all by yourself. Verse 25, and it came to pass when their hearts were merry that they said, call for Samson that he may amuse us. So they called for Samson out of the prison, and he provided amusement for them. And I think it's merciful for Samson. God could have gone into detail about what they did to Samson, like he goes into detail what they did with Jesus Christ and put a crown of thorns on his head and beat it and call, hail and all the stuff that they did to Jesus Christ. And the Bible goes into that detail, and it's, I think, a merciful thing and a blessed thing. I don't want to know what they did to Samson. Samson's a hero to me. I don't want to know what they did. And I'm glad God didn't tell me. It's enough for me to know they tortured him. And he stood between the pillars, says in verse 25. And now watch Samson's, his awareness. He's blind. He's been humiliated. Watch his awareness come back, his resolve come back. Samson said to the boy who held him by the hand, let me rest and let me feel the pillars that support the house, that I may lean on them. Which is, he's lying to the boy. You don't want to lean on the pillars. He doesn't want to rest. He knows exactly what those pillars do. He knew exactly how he could knock down that temple. And he's going to just go, boy, I'm really tired, and I just need to lean over here and rest a little bit. Can you let me feel the pillars? Verse 27. Now the house, by the way, this is one of the many, many places in the Bible where the temple is called the house. When we read in Acts chapter 2 that the sound of a mighty wind filled the house, it was the 37-acre temple that Herod had built. And here's the same thing. Now the house was full of men and women. That's the temple of Dagon, was full of men and women. And all the lords of the Philistines were there. And that would be the 5 lords of the Philistines. And I'm going to say this may be, no way to prove it, but this may be a use of the lords of the Philistines, which is a little more general than just simply the 5 lords, but would include the 5 lords and then various and sundry under rulers. And then on the roof were about 3,000 men and women who were watching while Samson provided entertainment, and this would be the upper echelon of the whole Philistine society. And it's important to see that, because this is how Samson is going to basically put an end to some of the Philistine dominance at the time. And so there's, the lords of the Philistines, there's 3,000 women. And then verse 28, Samson called to Yahweh. And I love this, because sometimes when people sin, sometimes when people are stupid, when they do stupid things and they know that they've disobeyed God, Samson revealed his vow. He disobeyed God. He dishonored God. He revealed his Nazirite vow. And, sometimes when people sin, they're so ashamed of it that they can't speak to Yahweh again. They can't reach into the well and get that strength to go to Yahweh and get what they need. And God's a God of love. The clearest ontological statement about God is love, and he will forgive. And if you reach out to him, he will come back over and over and over again. It doesn't matter how stupid you've been. It doesn't matter how sinful you've been. God reaches out and reaches people. And somehow Samson got that. He got that. And he knew he sinned. He knew he broke his vows. He knew that he had disobeyed God. But he calls out to Yahweh because his confidence in who he was and his mission started to come back to him. And he said, Lord Yahweh, remember me, please, and strengthen me, please. Only this once, God, because he knew he only was going to be strengthened that one time and he'd be dead. So just strengthen me this one time that I may be avenged with one act of vengeance on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Verse 29, and God did. God answered that prayer in spades. We don't know how many tons of pressure it would have taken to push over those pillars. But believe me, it wasn't like pushing over a fence post. These things were humongous, they were heavy, and they had a lot of weight on top of them. Samson took hold of the 2 middle pillars on which the house was supported, braced himself against them, the one with his right hand, the other with his left. And here he is in a crucifix position, one arm out to the right, one arm out to the left, standing on his feet below him, looking in the same basic position that Jesus Christ was in when he gave up the spirit. Verse 30, and Samson said, let me die with the Philistines, because the prophecy over his life was that he would begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. He said, let me die with the Philistines. And he pushed out with strength, and the house fell on the Lord and all the people who were in it. So the dead that he killed at his death were more than those who he killed in his life. And the Bible does not tell you this in so many words, but all of a sudden, what happens, this is the end of Judges, because Judges 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21, the last 5 chapters of Judges happened earlier in the Judges. So chronologically, Judges 16, this is the end of the book of Judges. And the next thing you're into then is 1 Samuel. And what do you see in 1 Samuel? Hannah has a baby named Samuel, and then Samuel becomes a prophet of the Lord, and then Samuel anoints the first king, Saul. And why did the Philistines even allow that? Because their whole nation was in turmoil. Their whole upper echelon of government had been completely annihilated. There would have been infighting and problems to the max. And God's people took advantage of that. Samuel was raised up, Saul was anointed, and then Saul picked up the banner and fought the Philistines. And guess who was at the head of the charge fighting the Philistines for King Saul? It was David. And then David became the next king, and it was under David's leadership that the Philistine nation was basically beaten into submission. And you don't hear about the Philistines being a problem anymore after the time of David. So this act of killing all of the upper echelon of the Philistine society opened the door for Israel to get a king and organize themselves and then begin to move against the Philistine army. And then in a, I don't know, it's sad to me, kind of a sad epilogue, if you will. Verse 31 says, then his brothers and all the house of his father, all of his relatives, his brothers and all the house of his father, all of his relatives came down and took him and brought. Why could they take him from Gath? Because all the leaders in the organization was gone. Excuse me. The house of his father, all his brothers and all the house of his father, they came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the burial site of Manoah, his father. Very typical. The son was buried where the father was buried. Abraham buried Sarah, and then Isaac buried Abraham in the same place. And, Rebekah was buried in the same place. And then Jacob was buried in the same place. And Leah was buried in the same place. And here they buried Samson where Manoah, his father, was buried. And I just think about this. It's like, it's just a little too little and it's a little too late, and I think about how we have to be alert to do things to bless and help fellow Christians while we're still alive, while we're still breathing. Thank you notes, a little email. Wow, I was really blessed by what you did. A quick phone call. There's so many little things that we can do to bless and support each other. Saw you the other night, love you, got it, was blessed to see you, let you know I'm praying for you, whatever it happens to be, and how we can support each other. And there's no evidence that he got one whit of support from his brothers in the house of his father until he was dead. And all of a sudden, oh, we'll go bury him. Yeah. I mean, I'm glad they buried him. It's nice that he got a good burial, but I'm frankly kind of annoyed by it. It's kind of a cowardly way out. We'll wait till the problem is dead, and then we'll go look like we're going to do something about it. Anyway, and then the Bible ends by saying, and he had judged Israel 20 years. Now, chapter 15 ended that way by saying he judged Israel 20 years. The Hebrew grammar is a little different between the end of chapter 15 and here, but it's the same basic message. He judged Israel for 20 years. And I think, man, I'm one of the ones that believe Jesus Christ's ministry was about a year and a half. So, Jesus Christ was, sure, he was alone. It was like a year and a half. Samson stood alone for 20 years. That's pretty freaking amazing. He is definitely one of the heroes of the faith, and I'm glad he's written up in Hebrews chapter 11. So this is the record of Samson. So many wonderful things we can learn from it, so many great lessons. Thank you for being here with me. It's sure a blessing and privilege to teach this stuff.